This video is a bit long overdue, but I'm still getting quite a large number of requests for this laptop, so I finally got my hands on one. One thing I'll need to do differently here is I'll have to review it in a vacuum, so like no comparisons to any other laptop. There are very few 14-inch gaming laptops on the market. I haven't tried any others myself, so this is going to be a first for me. And you also have to understand that you can't compare it against a 13 or a 15-inch gaming laptop because the size difference dictates how big of a cooler you can fit inside, how big of a battery you can fit, portability, lots of different reasons, right? So understand that this review will make some comparisons to 15-inch gaming laptops to use as a point of reference, just so you know what you might be sacrificing in exchange for the smaller form factor, but don't judge this laptop based on those comparisons. If this is better or worse than a 15-inch gaming laptop, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is good or bad. So let's start with the build quality. In terms of build, I would say this is among one of the nicest built laptops in general, not just for a gaming laptop. Structural rigidity is quite good, partly because smaller surface area means it's a bit harder to bend things. The keyboard deck does kind of bow downwards if you press hard on it, especially if you look at it at a sharp angle, but I don't think the base of any laptop I've personally reviewed over like $1,000 has ever been so bad to the point where I was concerned. But what makes this so enjoyable to me is the finish. So you know how rubber is soft and kind of sticky, and how polycarbonate or acrylic is hard and smooth? This is mostly hard and smooth, but with a subtle, like soft finish to it, kind of like rubber. And the softness makes it very comfortable to rest my hands on. For my personal preferences, this is by far my favorite laptop finish that I've come across. Even compared to something like Alcantara on Surface devices, which if you don't know what that is, it's kind of like fabric. I prefer the silicone/rubber feeling. It's very nice and pleasant. The hinge tension is very nicely weighted. It's one-hand openable, but it does have quite a bit of screen wobble. They don't seem to offer a touchscreen, so I don't think that's going to be a concern for most people, but for the few that do care, it is pretty wobbly. They have 3 different options for the screen that you can choose from. There's a 1440p 60Hz, a 1080p 120Hz, and a 1080p 60Hz, with adaptive sync depending on the specific model that you choose. The unit that I'm reviewing is configured with a 1080p 120Hz panel, and I think it's very nice to see that this laptop isn't handicapped with a 60Hz refresh rate. So one of the things that has traditionally been an issue with 13-inch gaming laptops, aside from the space restrictions for cooling, is that technology wasn't as mature as with 15 or 17-inch gaming laptops. So only now in 2020 did the Blade 13 get a 120Hz option, whereas 144Hz became mainstream back in 2018 for 15-inch gaming laptops. As far as refresh rates go, I think 120 is fine. Like given the GTX 1660 Ti that this laptop is running, I don't think 240Hz would be something most people would really pay extra for. Regarding image quality, this is actually pretty good. In fact, this is actually better across the board compared to 15-inch 144Hz panels, and roughly on par with 240 and 300Hz panels in terms of image quality. And just to be clear, like I know I'm referring to them by refresh rate, but 240 and 300Hz panels in general just also happen to be brighter and more color accurate than 144Hz panels. There was a fair amount of light bleed around the perimeter on my particular unit, and when I checked the response times with the UFO test, the image was pretty blurry. As far as normal use goes, it wasn't as bad as the Blade 13. That thing was bad enough to where text on websites were smearing all over the place and it was very obvious. The response times here are not perfect, but it wouldn't really classify this as particularly poor or bad enough to where it was noticeable without actively looking out for ghosting issues. This is obviously assuming you're not an enthusiast who can tell if there's ghosting without even thinking about it. And one more potential issue, there is straight up no webcam included, not internally nor externally, so be aware of that. The speakers on this are surprisingly good. You wouldn't really expect something like this to be as good as it is, but I would consider this to be among the best of any laptop. So hardware-wise, you have a pair of drivers handling the mid-range and treble, firing upwards, and a pair of drivers firing downwards onto your desk, which primarily handle the bass frequencies. Now, if you're wondering why the bass driver is pointed down, it's because reflecting off your desk will amplify the volume. So with the mid-range and treble, so like the top firing drivers, you don't really want to reflect them off your desk in order to maintain detail and clarity, but with bass frequencies, it doesn't really matter as much. So for a laptop specifically, the volume matters more and it definitely has good bass response. The 13-inch MacBook Pro is still the champ by a large margin, but from what I can remember of the Surface Laptop 3, this is very similar to that. Very nice bass response, vocals are well separated, they sound clean, and personally, for me, I use them for both YouTube videos and gaming just because I'm lazy and I don't like wearing headphones or earbuds in general. Okay, the keyboard on this is also very good, but there is one thing that I would like to see improved, which we'll talk about later. So surface level stuff first. The key travel is actually pretty good, and same with the tactility. It's been a while since I've reviewed the Surface Laptop 3, but from my memory and from what I can recall of it, regarding key travel and tactility specifically, I think they are very similar. So if you've ever tried that keyboard, then you'll have a pretty rough idea of what this will feel like. Now, the one and only thing that I dislike about this, I feel like the keycaps are a bit small, enough to where I will occasionally miss a key press. If you look at the keyboard on this, there's a pretty decently large gap between each key, meaning you can increase the surface area of each keycap without changing the otherwise perfect positioning. So that's one area that I think could be an improvement for the next revision. At the end of this typing test, you'll see my accuracy and typing speed. The keycap size wasn't really an issue once I had enough time to adapt to it, and overall, I would say this is in the lower end of the top 5% of all laptops easily. It's not quite as good as the old school 2010 MacBook Pro keyboards, but it's pretty close and gets a lot of things right. Okay, let's talk about the trackpad next. This is easily one of the best Windows trackpads, on par with something like the Surface Laptop 3 or the XPS 13. So hardware-wise, it's made of glass with a very similar silicone finish to the rest of the interior, and that gives it a very smooth surface. As in, you don't feel any grit or tiny bumps on the surface, and there's no feeling of friction or resistance when you drag your finger across the trackpad while pressing down firmly. My finger just glides right across the surface. Very nicely done. In terms of tracking accuracy, they also nailed it in that regard. This is one of very few trackpads where I can place my cursor exactly where I want it to be. It's very responsive, and I have this feeling that because the surface has almost no friction to it, that directly improves the tracking accuracy with very small movements. Like if you want to move your caret to a specific place in a text document, the caret being like the text cursor, this is accurate enough to let you do that with size 11 font pretty confidently. So very nicely done. The ports on this laptop are maybe a little less impressive depending on who you ask. If you compare it to a 15-inch gaming laptop, it's not really that great. Against a 13-inch gaming laptop, like the Blade 13, it is definitely better. So I guess it's right in the middle of the two, but on the left you have the charging port, HDMI 2.0. This particular USB-C port supports DisplayPort 1.4 and 65 watts of charging, which I will elaborate on later. You've also got a headphone jack, and on the right are two USB-A's and a USB-C port. This one is just USB 3.2 Gen 2, there's no display output or charging here. If you flip the laptop over, the bottom panel is held in place with way more screws than necessary, especially because it's also held down using clips. Getting inside was quite easy because the bottom right screw forces the panel up, letting you slip a credit card underneath to pry the panel off. Expandability isn't great, however. You only have one RAM slot and one M.2 slot. There's 8 GB of memory soldered on, which is a bit strange. They've always done that on their Zephyrus laptops for some reason. And lastly, the Wi-Fi card is located beneath the SSD. A lot of strange choices here, and I think this should be their top priority in terms of what to improve for the next revision. Regarding thermals and performance, this is going to be a tricky one. The numbers here are in comparison to 15-inch gaming laptops. Again, because this is the only 14-inch gaming laptop I've personally reviewed, it's not like I can put anything else there. I wouldn't judge the cooling performance based on how it compares. Those are obviously bigger laptops that can afford to have bigger fans and bigger heat pipes. But if you're curious how much of a performance penalty you're taking by moving to a smaller 14-inch form factor, this should give you a rough idea. And for anyone who paused to look at the graphs, note that you are allowed to directly compare between these laptops despite their different sizes and CPUs. Those are all Intel laptops, if you're curious. And that's because temperatures are a direct result of how much power the CPU is consuming. You can't compare just the temperatures, like if I crank the fans up, of course it's going to run cooler, but you can if you also include how much power the CPU or GPU is pulling. In other words, you are essentially comparing the TDP of each laptop's cooler, just like how desktop coolers also have TDP ratings. Given the size limitations of this laptop, I would say the cooling performance and the temperatures are both very good. Neither the CPU nor the GPU ever hit 80 degrees with the fans at full speed, so if you want to lower the fan speed to make them run quieter, then you've got a ton of headroom left before thermal throttling kicks in. I expected good thermals because their 15-inch Zephyrus laptops in the past have excelled in that regard, and they seem to have held up that reputation with this smaller form factor. There's a 76 watt-hour battery, which when paired with the smaller screen and the more efficient Ryzen CPU, should net you around 8 to 9 hours of battery life. I have heard reviews claiming 10 hours, but I guess maybe that just depends on your screen brightness. I think mine is a pretty safe estimate of what most people should get. And one thing that I haven't seen talked about that often is if you're pulling 10 hours now, 3 years later down the line when your battery has degraded, you'll still be able to pull 8 hours for a full-time job. So if that matters to you, I guess that's an added bonus. Okay, conclusion time. In a vacuum, so again, without any comparison to other laptops, this has been a very enjoyable laptop to use. One of my favorites by far. But when I compare it to the very best 15-inch gaming laptops that I've used, which have had like a decade to mature and develop, this is still among the very best. Like the Legion 7i has a nicer screen and the Alienware M15R3 has a better keyboard, but there's no single 15-inch gaming laptop that exceeds this in all categories. And for that reason, I can confidently say that anyone looking to move to a smaller laptop won't feel like they are losing out on anything significant. I would actually say that overall, in terms of build quality, the keyboard, trackpad, speakers, battery life, etc., this is easily in my top 3 thin and light high-performance Windows laptops, the other two being the Legion 7i and the Alienware M15R3, not the R2. I don't really have a favorite between these 3 laptops. It depends on what 2 specific areas I'm looking for since they each excel at different things. If you want a portable gaming laptop with no major compromises other than the mediocre upgradability, then I highly recommend this, and I think it's also priced fairly well, partly due to the AMD CPU. Okay, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. You really should consider subscribing if you haven't, because big subscribers means companies are more likely to send me laptops to review, which means that I can review laptops that you guys are interested in closer to their release date. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.